Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. You know how we love to take these deep dives into complex topics. And today we're tackling something that's all about efficiency and elegance in the world of software development, something you sent to us, actually.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at design patterns, specifically the prototype pattern.
So design patterns, for those who might be new to the concept, how would you describe them in like a nutshell?
They're essentially like proven blueprints for solving common software design problems, like tried and true solutions that developers have been using for ages to make their lives easier.
Okay, yeah, like having a toolkit full of prefabricated solutions ready to go, huh?
Exactly. And the prototype pattern we're focusing on today, well, it's all about creating copies of objects efficiently. And this becomes super helpful when you're dealing with objects that are, complex or take a lot of resources to build from scratch.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I can see how that would be a real time saver.
Yeah.
Especially, I guess, if you need multiple copies of the same object, but, with maybe slight variations or something.
Exactly. And to kind of illustrate that, let's look at one of the examples you sent over. Remember that travel agency, Acest?
Oh, yeah. They were having that issue with generating those personalized offer lists for all their clients.
Right. They needed to send out these personalized offer lists to like hundreds of clients. But each time they created this list of Ferte object to read all the offers from a file, it would take forever.
Ugh, yeah, I hate when things take forever. So how did this prototype pattern help them out?
Well, think about it this way. Instead of rebuilding that list of Ferte object from scratch for every single client and reading that whole file again and again each time, imagine if they had a master list of Ferte object that was already fully loaded with all the offers ready to go.
Okay, so like a master template, kind of.
Exactly. This master template becomes our prototype. And instead of rebuilding the whole thing each time, we just clone this prototype for each client.
Ah, I see. So it's like having a master cookie cutter. You design it once, and then you can just keep stamping out identical cookies, right? No need to redraw that cookie shape every time. But wouldn't copying a complex object, even if it's just a copy, still take a lot of resources?
That's where the idea of deep copying becomes super important. If you just do a simple or what we call a shallow copy, you're basically just creating a new reference that points to the same underlying data.
Oh, so it's not really a separate copy then.
Right. It's like both cookie cutters are still using the same dough. So if one cutter changes something, it affects all of them.
Yeah, messy. And you wouldn't really be saving any resources that way either.
Exactly. But with deep copying, you're creating a totally independent duplicate of the object, like having separate batches of dough for each cutter, right? That way, changes to one copy don't mess up the others.
Ah, much cleaner.
Yeah.
Deep copying. Got it. But I do remember something about deep copying being potentially tricky. Something about the default clone method not always doing what you'd expect.
You're right. The source material even had a warning about that, specifically with Java's clonable interface and its clone method. It doesn't always guarantee a deep copy, and that can lead to problems if you're not careful.
Right. So what kind of things should developers watch out for when they're implementing deep copying? Any specific pitfalls to avoid?
Definitely. One of the biggest ones is when you're dealing with objects that contain other objects as members, you've got to make sure that every single level is properly duplicated. Otherwise, you might end up with these weird dependencies between your supposed copies and
then things start to get unpredictable.
Exactly. Bugs start popping up, behavior gets wonky, and it becomes a real headache to debug.
Yikes. Okay, so deep copying, powerful tool, but use with caution. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit to that other example you sent over, the racing game, remember?
Oh, yeah, the one with all the spectators in the stands.
Right. They were having some performance issues too, right? Something to do with creating all those individual spectator characters.
Exactly. Each spectator was represented by this complex persona object, which had all sorts of attributes and calculations going on behind the scenes. And doing that for thousands of spectators was really slowing things down.
Yeah, I can imagine. So how did they use the prototype pattern to speed things up?
Well, just like with that list of Ferte object, they realized they didn't need to calculate all those complex body proportions and stuff for every single persona from scratch. So what they did was create this base persona model with all those calculations already done. This model became their prototype.
Okay, so instead of crunching numbers for every single spectator, they just cloned a pre-calculated model. Smart. But what exactly made these persona objects so complex in the first place? Like, what kind of stuff was the game calculating?
Well, imagine each persona having attributes like height, body type, clothing, maybe even accessories. Then the game also has to figure out their position on the screen, taking into account things like perspective and making sure they're not blocking each other.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot to calculate for each character. No wonder things were slowing down.
Exactly. But by cloning a pre-built prototype, they could skip all those calculations for each individual spectator.
Right, so it's not just about the visual appearance of the characters. It's about all the data and calculations associated with each one. And deep copying ensures that each spectator has their own independent set of attributes. Now, speaking of components, I noticed the source material included a diagram breaking down the key parts of the prototype pattern.
Oh, yeah. It's a nice way to visualize how it all works.
Could you walk us through it?
Absolutely. At the very top, you have the prototype interface. This interface basically defines that cloning method that we've been talking about. Think of it as the blueprint for making copies.
Okay, the blueprint. Got it. What else?
Then below that, you have the concrete prototype. And this is where the magic happens. It's the actual class that implements that cloning process and makes the copies. So the prototype is the concept, and the concrete prototype is the actual thing doing the work.
Okay, that makes sense. So you've got the blueprint, and then you've got the actual construction crew, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the prototype pattern can be combined with other design patterns. What are some other areas where this pattern really shines?
Oh, there are so many cool combinations. One that comes to mind is the factory pattern. Remember, the factory pattern is all about creating objects without needing to specify their exact class. So imagine a factory that manages a bunch of different lista offerte prototypes.
Okay, so like one for summer offers, one for family packages, one for luxury getaways, and so on.
Exactly. And based on the client's request, the factory can just pick the right prototype and clone it. Super efficient.
That's slick. But I imagine managing all these different prototypes could get a bit complicated, right? You make sure they're all updated correctly and everything.
That's a really good point. While prototype can save you a lot of time and resources, it does add that extra layer of management. You got to keep your prototypes up to date and make sure they're all in sync.
So it's a trade-off, like
Yeah.
anything else.
Right. And sometimes if creating a new object is really simple and doesn't take much effort, or if your objects are constantly changing and have a lot of variations, then prototype might not be the best fit. There might be other patterns that are more suitable for those situations.
So it's not a silver bullet, but it definitely has its place. Now, besides the factory pattern, what other patterns might work well alongside prototype?
Ooh, let's see. Well, the decorator pattern is a good one. Remember, the decorator pattern lets you dynamically add responsibilities to objects without modifying their core structure. So you could use prototype to clone an object and then apply decorator to it. That way, you keep the original object untouched and create a modified copy with those extra features.
Oh, I like that. So you're essentially extending the functionality of the object through cloning and decorating. What about other patterns?
Another cool one is the composite pattern. It's all about representing objects in a tree-like structure where you have individual objects and groups of objects that can be treated the same way. So you could use prototype to easily clone elements at the same level in that hierarchy.
Ah, I see. So it's
Yeah.
like cloning branches of a tree without having to recreate the whole tree structure each time. Wow, it's amazing how all these patterns can work together. It's like they form their own little ecosystem of efficient solutions.
Exactly. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, and by understanding how they interact, you can really create some elegant and powerful software designs.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. To recap for our listeners, the prototype pattern is all about making copies of objects quickly and efficiently, especially when those objects are complex or take a lot of resources to build. We saw how it can really speed things up in those examples we talked about, the travel agency and the racing game.
Right. And we also talked about the importance of deep copying and how it ensures that each copy is truly independent.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that prototype isn't always the perfect solution. Deep copying can have its complexities, and there are times when other design patterns might be a better fit. So it's all about choosing the right tool for the job. But as a final thought for you, our dear listener, what other real-world situations could benefit from this prototype pattern? Think about scenarios where you need lots of similar objects, and creating each one from scratch is just too time-consuming or resource-heavy. Maybe you're working on a project right now where this pattern could be a real game changer.
Yeah, get creative. The possibilities are endless.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep those brains engaged.
And happy coding!